So just before we begin, I would like to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we gather on, and just to pay our respects to elders past and present. It's really such a privilege to be practicing and gathering here on such a beautiful land that, is stolen land. So I would also like to start with a bit of humility, just to offer. This is my first talk here, and first talk of this kind, and really this is like a bit of a personal exploration. I'm not sure. I don't know. Coming into this, I wasn't sure how much other people would get out of it, but I'm also not sure. Not as confident as I would like to be in getting my ideas across, but I put a lot of passion into this, and I hope that comes through. So bear with me. At the very least, you'll get some poetry and drama and inner child dialogue, maybe some thoughts to walk away with, and also a content warning. Obviously I'm talking about food and fasting tonight. So food is like a very, can be a very sensitive area of neurosis and disorder for many people. And in this exploration, I'm coming from a place of well-informed curiosity and clear intention. I'm kind of just really fascinated with how shake-ups in our lives can sort of loosen things up and help clear the way for the path towards freedom. So the purpose of this talk really is not to be prescriptive. I don't want people walking away with the idea that I think people should be eating less or not comforting themselves and things like this. It's I just want to convey an aspect of curiosity into the ways that we seek pleasure and satisfaction in how we consume. And that's not just about food. But I've also thought about the ethics of sharing this talk, considering I don't have a lot of knowledge of nutrition, and I just really know my experience, and that's what I wanted to share. Is basically fasting has helped me overcome a lot of unhealthy eating patterns, and that seems counterintuitive, but it's given me a lot more interest and enthusiasm for taking care of myself, my body, and doing what I can to help the world in whatever small ways. I guess renunciation practices might not be accessible for everyone. We have to work from where we're at, and everyone has their own journey, sort of thing. But if you do try fasting, do your research, talk to your doctor and be accountable. So I kind of want to build a bit of a context for fasting within Buddhist ethics. I don't know how many of you have heard of the 5 precepts. We have them here up on this poster here with the colourful spots. They are a set of they're not rules, but they're guidelines that the Buddha sort of gave to, I think, to generally lay people. There was much more rules or precepts for monastics and other people taking deeper vows. But the 5 precepts basically are a means of reducing the suffering that we bring into the world through our thoughts, actions, and speech to ourselves and others. And I think with the positive counterparts to these that we chant, if any of you have been upstairs for meditation, they were written by Sangharakshita, is that right? The founder of Triratna. And so we have the 5 precepts, which are not to kill, not to steal, not to commit sexual misconduct, which is using our sexual energy to harm others. I'll come back to that one, but also not to lie and not to take intoxicants. So the 3rd precept, basically, its positive counterpart to not committing sexual misconduct is we chant, I will, I undertake training precept not to commit sexual misconduct. with stillness, simplicity, and contentment, I purify my body. And so this stillness, simplicity, and contentment, it doesn't immediately sort of speak to the positive aspect of the sexual misconduct. It's more of it speaks of more of like a craving for like almost a bodily sort of wanting of sense experience. And I find it interesting in the Plum Village tradition, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's lineage. They include consumption under the 5th precept, but it's sort of the same thing. There's just this little bit that I'll read within the larger precept, which is, I am determined not to gamble or to use alcohol, drugs, or any other products which contain toxins, such as certain websites, electronic games, TV programs, films, magazines, books, and conversations. So like he really sort of broadens this out into all sorts of ways that we can pollute our mind and over-consume. And the point of this is that developing mindfulness can be more rewarding than any of these pursuits if seen through to its, greatest degree. So renunciation, while it's not immediately apparent in these precepts, because they sort of seem to be about developing virtuousness in the world, but we can read renunciation into the precepts, and they can also evolve through our practice. It's also just such a deep part of the Buddha's earliest teachings, and even his own experience. He was before he became the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince. He was quite comfortable, and he had a wife and child, and he left this all behind in search of the path to enlightenment. And there's this sutta called the Mahasachaka Sutta, where he describes all of the ascetic practices, which are quite intense, which he did over 6 years. He sort of lived in this very, very simple way, almost just ignoring his body or like pushing it to its limits. It's kind of like his emo phase. The Buddha, at some point, he realized that asceticism was not the way because it was kind of destroying him. However, later on, he recommended that monastics take no food after midday. And the Theravada lineage still practice this. There's lay people take up what's called the 8 precepts on festival days, which, as well as the original 5, there's also abstinence from all sexual activity, entertainment, adornments, and luxurious seats and beds. Mahayana practices, they expand the first precept out to include vegetarianism for monastics as just a general vow that they take. And also they avoid what's called the 5 pungent foods, which refer to alliums such as garlic, leek, onion, spring onion, and chives, because they excite the senses. And in the Thai forest tradition, which is another Theravadan lineage, they have what's called the 13 Dhutangas, which is a Pali word for renunciation. These are all sorts of rules and vows around like just the most basic necessities that we have, all sorts of food, clothing, and shelter austerities, including eating 1 meal a day, which is like pretty similar to modern intermittent fasting. So why am I talking about this? I guess I'll share a little bit about what led me down this path. I feel like it's quite common, or I wouldn't say common, but for Westerners coming to Buddhism, to have fantasies of living a monastic life, or that's what Buddhism means to them. Like it's often, I feel like it's often in response to suffering and needing things to change. It's this kind of like, I just need to do away with everything and just live really simply, or like my life isn't working or something, I need to shave my head. So I think it's also probably the most destabilizing thing you can do at a point where you're feeling like that, is to run away to a monastery. But so I wanted to kind of find ways of bringing more renunciation into my life, and finding, sort of insight through that. And as Dante Chitta mentioned in study group last year, we were talking about ethics, and I wanted to put this, or just wanted to deepen this area of the third precept in regards to craving and food for me, because, I noticed that I turn to food for all sorts of reasons, including hunger, but also boredom, idleness, comfort, reward, habit, just like all sorts of things that aren't hunger. And these sort of just kind of, I noticed them happening. I'm like, why am I doing that? But I'm still doing it. And I can't stop myself. I just need to eat this thing right now because it will make me feel better. Anyway, spirit of renunciation, I decided to try a 72-hour fast, just to see what comes up and see if I could work with it. I'm not unfamiliar with fasting, but I wouldn't consider myself good at it. 3 days is quite a long time. So, day 1. With an empty stomach, I approach hunger with stillness, calmness, and quietness, hoping for a glimpse of the ways in which I am bound, not by hunger, but by preference and desire. Such thoughts catch our attention, wafting through the mind like the smell of freshly baked croissants. Habitual impulses that guide our hand back to the cookie jar or make another cup of tea without us realizing. We disguise them as convenience, as if I just eat a lot of cheese and crackers now, I won't have to worry about dinner later. Or they show up as epiphanies, like the moment you suddenly realize you need chocolate right now. We dream up rich imagery in our minds of like roast pumpkin and mushrooms fried with butter and thyme, tomato salsa, crispy sourdough, smashed avocado drizzled with lemon and olive oil, sautéed asparagus, sprinkles of garlic salt on kale chips. There is never this much clarity of desire when I haven't chosen to go without food. Even on a good day, I only get as far as bread. So as we can see, it's really easy to get carried away with sense craving. When we take away comforts and necessities, the mind does not easily acquiesce. It's sort of like when we sit down to meditate, all of our thoughts become really urgent. So I kind of want to turn from a bit of a personal lens to a more broader thing, because I find that these internal states can be reflected externally through our interactions with consumption. And the practice of renunciation really speaks to me on an ethical level because of the reality we face with climate crisis. It's very clear that the future of life on Earth relies on some drastic changes to how we interact with our planet. And food is one of the factors that lies at the heart of this problem. A lot of questions for me come up like really basic things like, where is my food coming from? Is what I'm eating good for my body and good for the environment? How much do I actually need to survive? We live with so much privilege in the West. We're not even used to being hungry. We have so much access to food. And so it's become sort of, important to me to become familiar with hunger and the effect it has on my mind so that I can try and bring about a bit more contentment and awareness of my consumption. If we want to develop a deeper connection with food, the earth, and the crisis that we're facing, we can look to teachings on interconnectedness. This could be expressed in a simple piece of food like toast. You've got bread, which is made of flour, water, yeast, salt. The flour made from grains, which rely on a healthy balance of the elements. Electricity for the toaster. Did the bread come in a plastic bag? Was it sitting in a truck in traffic, making its way to you? Were the workers paid well? The company's investments, impacts on the environment? Did you put butter on the toast? What were the cows' living conditions? This web becomes infinitely more complex with a more substantial meal. There's this saying in like kind of left-leaning circles, like political statement that says, there is no ethical consumption under late capitalism. And basically what it states is that in our economy, it's impossible to spend money in a way that you find that somewhere along the line, someone has been exploited for their labor. So it's like, everything we take is potentially taken from others. And, it's quite a big statement to make, and whether or not it's true in all cases. But basically what I'm getting at is that consumption is an interaction with the entire phenomenal universe. And we've evolved to be in constant give and take. Our environment and us really feed each other, which is something I'll come back to later. But this really goes beyond our conceptual limits of how individual action affects the chain of supply. And so it's really important for us to know where we're putting our money, energy, time, attention, all these sorts of things. And mindfulness really helps with this. But there's degrees of ethical considerations in the choices that we make. We have to balance the best choices available to us with the choices that allow us to thrive, rather than standing in the supermarket for hours agonizing over which tub of hummus is going to leave us with a clean conscience. I've been there. I call this the sort of balance of renunciation. So it's on one hand, you're trying to live comfortably, which is like working with desire. And on the other hand, you're trying to live contentedly. There's opportunity there for being able to live with less if we can. It's about meeting our needs and doing the inner work to reduce the desire that we have for things. So we can only take as much as we truly need. Because any more is really giving in to desire. And in the third precept, when we work against this, it's sort of the underlying root. The underlying root is greed accompanied by delusion, which is about taking without truly seeing or considering the consequences of the action of that taking. Food is a gift. Are we accepting it gracefully, or is there a kind of anxious grasping behind it? Day 2. Hunger pangs sing like an empty bowl, ringing bells in the shrine room of the mind, bringing awareness to the aliveness of the body, and another day without food. It's called a fast, but it goes so slow. Time crawls past. All movement becomes a flow. No unnecessary fidget or flare. Nothing to spare for such luxuries. Washing my hair, no longer a chore, but a careful choreography, cautious of slipping in the shower. A slow dance with death. The morning coffee without honey, a cup of bitter disappointment. Caffeine jitters with low blood sugar, a sweet tooth's disenchantment. Sitting like a cutting, waiting in water, with faith that I won't wilt, but propagate the peaceful aspects of a practice in grounding. Growing roots, seeking truth, finding nothing to stand on. Even water loses its sparkle. So the next, where am I? The next sort of reflection that I'd like to work on, and feels like it's a bit far out there, but let's see how we go. It's basically about what we're seeking underneath our craving. And so there's this we can become aware of this lack that we feel behind all worldly pleasures, means of coping and escaping or indulging in reality. It's this feeling that nothing truly satisfies us, and this is called dukkha in Buddhism. It's a word that sort of translates often as suffering, but it can also mean unsatisfactoriness or stress or a number of things. But basically, what I've found is that where there's dukkha, there is what I like to call spiritual hunger. And spiritual hunger, for me, comes out of experiences that are marked by suffering. It's where one sees there must be a deeper truth, even though you can't feel it or know what it is yet. It's just that however we're living, our current way of being, it just doesn't make sense anymore. And I think this is where renunciation comes in. It helps us to delve deeper to see what we're truly trying to comfort in ourselves. And it sort of brings our hunger more towards the surface so we can work with it more clearly. I think we can really find ways to turn our hunger towards the Dharma. The Dharma being, truth or the Buddhist teaching. There's this great word, it's Dhamma Chanda, Sanskrit. It sort of translates as skillful desire or desire for the good. And so it's about sublimating our desires into spiritual pursuits, such as developing positive qualities like the stillness, simplicity, and contentment that we chant in the third precept. A reflection that I've sort of been working with is that one must find joy in renunciation for it to bring true freedom. Without joy, renunciation becomes more like repression. And this is something that I'm constantly working with is am I trying to cover up something here, or am I trying to understand? It's like, I'm sure we've all heard of spiritual bypassing. It's where we cover things over through our spiritual practice that we're not ready to look at, we don't want to look at, we don't want to acknowledge. But that feels more like an unconscious thing, whereas it's really important to be quite intent on what you're giving up and why. So the part that I'm kind of like not sure how this is going to land, but there's this sutta that I really love. It's called the Agana Sutta, and it's basically a Buddhist creation myth of evolution and devolution of life on Earth. And it talks about how flora and fauna evolved together at the same time. Just a quick description of it. It's so the Buddha presents an account of evolution that shows how human choices are an integral part of the ecological balance and how excessive greed destroys the order of nature. And the central aspect of this sutta is food, and how over time humans come to hoard and protect food, which leads to inequality and poverty and war and things like this. And between world systems, so Buddhist cosmology has a sort of cyclic view of time, and in between time when there's humans on the earth, the Buddha describes there being these what he calls radiant beings, and they sort of just live in the winds above the earth, and he describes them as being mind-made, self-luminous, coursing through the air, established in beauty for a long time. They kind of sound like spirits almost, and what's left of the essence of life after the world ends in flames. And they're referenced in the Dhammapada, which this is why I got this here. Just briefly, there's this phrase. It's talking about living without hate, affliction, without the three poisons, basically, greed, hatred, and delusion. And then the last verse, it goes, "How very happily we live, we who have nothing, we will feed on rapture like the radiant gods." And it's this word, there's this word in the original where it's it's a Sanskrit word, pitibaka, which translates as feeding on rapture. And I just find this such beautiful symbolism. It speaks of finding a deeper kind of joy in our experience and being able to live on positive mental states and emotional states beyond our cravings. It's kind of like finding joy in the delight of simplicity and ritual and meditation. It's the difference between picking a flower and just appreciating its beauty. There's been I was trying to read more about this before I came here, but there's been studies how visualizing food can help you lessen your cravings for that food, which is just amazing, like the mind can do that. And similarly, also remembrance of times when we have made others happy or acted skillfully, which is one of the 10 contemplations that the Buddha recommends that we reflect on daily, which is remembrance or contemplation of virtue, basically. So it's kind of like we can fulfill our hunger in more selfless ways, I feel, is what I'm getting at, is through generosity or helping others. And taste is just so fleeting, but virtue can be far more satisfying, is what this is talking about. So yeah, I think we can be comforted by the Dharma is kind of the point of that whole reflection there. How am I going for time? 1:15. I'll just share a quick poem. I think I haven't got much longer, but this is a poem by Rumi, who's I think, I didn't write that down, I think 7th century, 15th century mystic and Sufi poet. So, this poem's called Fasting. There's a hidden sweetness in the stomach's emptiness. We are lutes, no more, no less. If the soundbox is stuffed, full of anything, no music. If the brain and the belly are burning clean with fasting, every moment a new song comes out of the fire. The fog clears and a new energy makes you run up the stairs in front of you. Be emptier and cry like the reed instruments cry. Emptier, write secrets with the reed pen. It goes on, it's beautiful, and I feel like he really got a lot out of not eating. Big inspiration for me. So, day 3. I wake up exhausted, stomach rumbling, mind frantically searching for something to cling to. No breakfast, no routine, no energy. What am I to do? And as I'm sitting there, I begin to cry. That's odd. What's wrong? I'm hungry. I know. What about another glass of water? I'm bored of water. Well, not much longer. I'm starving. No, you're not. Starvation occurs when the body has burnt up all of its fat stores. I'm dying. Don't be melodramatic. We're all dying. There's nothing special about you. Nobody loves me. Where did that come from? How did love get so deeply associated with hunger? Sometimes we don't realize what we're feeding. And in the spirit of compassion, self-compassion, I decide this is enough. Immediately, the mind starts painting a picture. The perfect little nook in some comfortable and quiet cafe full of succulents, my table bathed in sunlight, alone with a book that carries me away to a timeless Sunday morning with the best coffee I've ever had, made from ethically sourced beans by a barista who gets paid above award, and a well-balanced meal made with local produce with flavor combinations I've never tasted before, soothing and delighting and ultimately satisfying. the unproliferated reality, uncomfortable seating, a cold draft. The menu is a short novel. There's too many choices here. I'm overstimulated by the amount of knickknacks. Some guy in the corner is looking at me. Coffee and food arrive at the same time. Not enough hands to eat, drink, read. Coffee goes cold. Waiter puts a reserved sign down, encouraging me to hurry. The whole ordeal is over in 15 minutes and $25, and I'm out the door, left with a feeling of wanting. Hunger, satisfied, craving, intensified. Might just settle for porridge on the couch next time. So just some personal reflections that I'll end with. After breaking a fast, I have so much gratitude and appreciation and inspiration around food. Fasting's what's actually gotten me out of some really unhealthy eating patterns. By renewing my enthusiasm from spending days building hunger and planning something really creative to cook. Eating slowly, mindfully, sitting silently at the end of a meal, I can even remember my favorite mouthfuls. We cannot deny our need for consumption, even during sleep and meditation. We rely on the world to support us. As Dharma practitioners, it's important for us to see deeply into the interconnectedness of nature that allows us to pursue enlightenment and to choose wisely about how we use the energy we gain from heating our world. I'm going to finish there. But